During Vanilla Classic, players would often go the extra mile to get that extra little bit of DPS. Whether it was stacking all the available consumables, collecting all the open world buffs from around Azeroth, or paying your disc priest 5 gold per power infusion. The content might have been easy, but that did not stop players from wanting to compete with one another on the DPS meters. And vanilla class design and buff stacking could get really out of control sometimes. Small trinkets from quests, consumables, and items that were added into the game because they sounded like a cool idea have come to be relied upon as key pieces to solving puzzles as to how to get the best performance out of your class and specialization that you possibly can. For some classes though, they had to think quite far outside the box or explore ways to play which, well, weren't exactly all that intuitive. In fact, some of the techniques people used are more or less meme-worthy, but still fun to remember. Today I'm going to go over a few more ways that players min-max their characters in Vanilla Classic. But first, a quick word from today's sponsor, Dragon Raja. Dragon Raja is a huge open-world MMORPG mixing fantasy and cyberpunk styles. It has some of the best graphics you'll find on the game that's available across mobile devices as well as PC, and is also free to play. Right now, Dragon Raja is celebrating their 3rd anniversary with tons of gifts for new and returning players alike, including loads of diamonds as a currency to get you started, as well as a limited time outfits such as Midsummer Tale, Grove Cavalier, or Ghost Sugar. You can also get upgrades to your motor as well as avatar as part of this anniversary. The map is also expanding with a brand new area, Cambridge, and whilst it may look a little different from the one you've heard of in the UK, at least the weather is very relatable. On top of that, the 13th new class has also been added, the Shadow Fencer. They combine sword combat with a shadow which follows after, that can not only deal huge damage but also disable enemies. There's tons of rewards and there's never really been a better time to jump into Dragon Raja. After all, it's free, so why not? You can download and join the 3rd anniversary celebrations via my link below. Many thanks to Dragon Raja for the sponsor today. Back to WoW. Of course, we're starting with Feral Druids. Again, I swear every time I do one of these videos, some kind of weird new tech appears for Feral Druids. I think they're just trying not to play the game normally on purpose at this point. Anyways, back in Classic, Ferals worked a little differently from every other melee class. One of the biggest reasons why is because they didn't attack directly with their weapons, instead their auto attacks were shredding away in cat form or mauling in bear. This meant they couldn't benefit from some of the most powerful buffs or enchants in the game, such as Wind Fury weapon or Crusader. Each of these needed your melee weapon to be hitting directly in order to proc, and you couldn't exactly just drop form and start meleeing in order to proc them. That would just be too much of a DPS loss. But what if there was a way to bypass this requirement, a buff that didn't need you to hit directly with your melee weapon and instead would just proc off any physical damage dealt? Well, fortunately for Ferals, such an item existed. Dragon's Breath Chili. Craftable at 200 cooking, this recipe was sold by vendors across Dustswallow Marsh and Desolace. Eating it will place a 10-minute poison effect on the player, which would give attacks a chance to proc a fire breath type effect in a wide cone in front of you. The proc chance for this is a little bit unclear, but it wouldn't be Classic if they just told you how something works now, would it? Wowhead reckons a 5% proc chance with a 10-second internal cooldown, but other comments suggested a lower proc chance and no internal cooldown. Whilst how often this thing procs might be a little bit uncertain, what isn't is the fact that this proc effect used to scale 1-to-1 with the caster's spell power, meaning the more spell power that you have, the bigger effect this proc will be. This, of course, meant that, in theory, you could min-max a fire-breathing feral druid DPS specialization, which would actually have access to cleave damage, or alternatively pop the consume on a feral tank for better access to burst threat. In Classic, there were a ton more consumables too, including consumables specifically designed for certain spell schools. If you were going all out, you would be able to pop a flask of supreme power, a greater arcane elixir, and an elixir of greater firepower to buff up your fire feral spec. Now, doing this practically presented several problems, such as the fact that Molten Core and Blackwing Lair are full of mobs which are completely immune to fire damage. Mages were even playing Frost during these tiers. Also, I really hope you like farming gold if you wanted to do this, because wow, these consumables will get expensive. On the positive side, having cleave, especially in dungeons, is very useful. You would 100% pull threat if chili procced on a pull, or maybe it would break a polymorph, or pull mobs that are way in the back because the proc radius is so large. Maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. You also may remember Druid tier gear in Classic just has pretty much every single stat in the game because, I don't know, Druids, they do a bit of everything, right? Just give them a bit of every stat. Playing Fire Feral, you're taking much better advantage of this questionable itemization. Silver linings, right? Other melee classes could do this too, but I just wanted to highlight the ferals here. Speaking of fire, fire mages had an interesting tech back in Classic to min-max their DPS. It was actually an effort that all the fire mages in the raid had to organize among themselves to get the most out of the talent Ignite. Now in Classic there was a finite number of debuffs allowed on an enemy mob. This was set to 16. Any debuff that went over that limit would cancel out something else which had already been applied to the mob, and you really didn't want to cancel out your Sunder Armor or your Curse of Recklessness, for example. So if you had two mages spamming Fireball, there would be the small damage over time effect of the Fireball spell itself and the Ignite damage over time from any crits that they dealt. You can see how this is going to cause problems, as that's a lot of debuff slots for two players. The Fireball dot itself was treated as a minor debuff, however, and it did next to no damage either, so it would be pushed off the debuff table by itself. Ignite, however, was treated as a major debuff, unlike any other passively applied damage over time effect in the game, that is, which more or less meant it's not going to get pushed off the debuff table. However, if each mage was taking up a major debuff slot by playing fire, the spec would kind of just not have been viable. Debuffs are valuable things that help the whole raid after all, not just personal DPS gains. Fortunately, somebody at Blizzard realized this and made an adjustment to Ignite, where all mages share the same Ignite debuff. However, only the first 5 critical strikes applied will determine how much damage this damage over time effect will do. Any of the fire crits after that will only refresh the damage over time instead of modifying it any further. This was called a rolling Ignite. So to start off the fight, you would Scorch to get the fire vulnerability debuff up as soon as possible, cast a few frost bolts so the weak Ignite effect had time to drop off, and then pop all your trinkets, your cooldowns and so on, and hope to get the biggest fireballs possible. Whichever mage dealt the first crit would also claim the Ignite for the purposes of the DPS meters, meaning on some fights, such as Chromagus with good RNG, mages could do more than TBC levels of DPS. I always like to think of rolling Ignite as all the mages are building a big bonfire together and then maintaining it with crits. A quick one that I remember people also doing in Blackwing Lair was a tactic that anybody could use on Veilstraz. One of the mechanics in the encounter was burning adrenaline. This will place a debuff on a target, increasing damage done and reducing cast time by 100%. However, after a short duration, you would explode, instantly dying and taking anybody nearby with you. And in Classic, there were also world buffs in the raid, so going to all that preparation to get them and then getting the bomb on Veil was pretty annoying. It is an unavoidable death mechanic after all, or is it? Well, it turns out that 100% cast time reduction worked on any cast, including Hearthstone. You hearthed out before the debuff timer hit 0 and it would remove that debuff from you instantly, keeping you alive and keeping your world buffs active. After a certain incident involving Zul'Gurub and a blood plague, Blizzard became a little more wary of allowing debuffs to be taken outside of raid, so let's just say that. After that, you'd have to be summoned back outside the entrance portal of Blackwing Lair and then rejoin your raid, but at least you'd still have all your world buffs running. Next, we have a hunter trick to optimize DPS. This started off in Classic, but it didn't become super popular until late the Burning Crusade. It's called melee weaving. So to this day in Wrath of the Lich King, there's a minimum range the hunter must stand from the target in order to be able to attack them with ranged attacks. In Wrath, it's 5 yards, even though when you're fighting any dragon boss, it feels more like 25. But back in vanilla, it was 8 yards. However, one big difference is that the swing timers for melee and ranged attacks were tracked separately. This means you could fire off a shot from your bow at 8 yards, run inside the 5-yard range, land a melee attack with your weapon, run back out to 8 yards, and your swing timer would be coming up again on your bow. Rinse and repeat, and that is a melee weave. This was done to min-max the 2 different swing timers and would lead to higher DPS than regular play, at much greater effort and much greater margin for error. In TBC, the minimum distance for ranged attacks was moved down from 8 yards to 5. Yes, melee is also 5 yards too. Technically, there's a very small difference between the two. This meant the process of a successful melee weave could be achieved with a lot less movement. On top of that, both factions now had access to Wind Fury on a big 2-handed weapon, which also added a nice extra bit of DPS. Looking at all the top logs for Brutalis, the big patchwork fight to the Sunwell, it's all BM Hunters melee weaving. Moving into Wrath, Blizzard made a change where melee and ranged weapons swing timers now share the same cooldown, effectively stopping this from being a viable way to gain DPS overnight. Finally, I'm going to try and explain something which I'm pretty sure I still don't even understand. Weapon skill scaling in Classic WoW. So weapon skill, you all know what it is. You get a nice big upgrade, you go enchant it, gem it, put it on, hit something, and then get a message in your chat saying your skill in maces is now 14 and feel very bad. It's still a thing in Wrath and was in TBC, and in these expansions it's kind of just a number you need to get maxed out to be dealing the most effective damage with whatever type of weapon it is you're using. There used to be a ton more importance tied to your weapon skill, and it wasn't until a later patch in TBC when expertise was introduced as a stat that weapon skill got relegated to a semi-forgettable thing you just need to max out. Expertise, of course, affecting the chance for your attacks to be dodged or parried, making it an important stat alongside hit. Back in Classic, it was a whole other ball game. Weapon skill was so important and so rarely available on items that it made a level 44 pair of male bind on equipped gloves best in slot for warriors for near the entire game. Why though? Well, in very simple term, weapon skill on items could take you beyond the weapon skill cap, and the benefit from weapon skill continued to scale beyond the cap too. It was like the difference between attacking a mob that's 3 or more levels above you, where their level shows as orange, and a mob that's within 2 levels of you, where their level shows as yellow. To go in depth a little bit more, weapon skill is normally capped out at 300, and in vanilla it affected the chance for your attacks to be dodged, parried, blocked, but also importantly impacted your hit chance as well as glancing blows. What's a glancing blow though? Well, against an enemy that's a higher level than you, you'll have a chance to land a glancing blow. Against a level 63, for example, which is the level that all raid bosses would have been with 300 weapon skill, your attacks would have a 40% chance to be a glancing blow. When that happens, they deal 65% of their regular damage, which is a pretty big hit to your DPS. But what if we got our weapon skill above what is the normal cap? Well, with the likes of Edge Masters, the human ratio for swords, or axes for orcs, you could do exactly that. Going up to 305 weapon skill caused you to be able to overcome the built-in 1% miss chance on all attacks in the game too. Here's a short little message from a blue post on this. They say there is some code in 1.12 that explicitly adds a modifier that causes the first 1% of hit gained from talents or gear to be ignored against monsters with more than 10 defense skill above the attacking player's weapon skill. This means the so-called hit cap is in effect 9% rather than 8% for a player with 300 weapon skill fighting a level 63 monster with a defense skill of 315. With a weapon skill of 305 from sword spec from humans or axe spec from orcs, this hit modifier is no longer in place against monsters 3 or more levels above you, provided you're using the correct weapon type, that is. This makes weapon skill very good against raid level monsters. As for glancing blows, when at 300 weapon skill they were a 40% chance for auto attacks to deal 65% of normal damage, at 305 weapon skill this was changed to a 40% chance for auto attacks to deal 85% of normal damage. So all in all, these gloves, or getting to 305 weapon skill, allowed you to overcome the base 1% miss chance and reduce the effect of glancing blows by 20%. So you can see why items such as Edge Masters fetch such a high price, or alternatively you could just roll human and orc and save yourself yourself a few thousand gold and get this racial bonus for free. All in all, there were so many ways to min-max your character in Classic. The gameplay might have been simple, the bosses might have been easy, but to actually understand how and why everything worked the way it did does get very complicated when you start to look into it. I mean, even during Classic, a near 20-year-old game at this point, players were still trying to fully uncover exactly how everything works. And on TBC servers that are now in Wrath, we're still discovering new min-maxes, new techniques, new talent builds, and so on. It's definitely one of the more interesting areas to cover in videos, and proves that even a game this old, that many think is super solved, can still throw out the odd surprise now and again. Was there anything else from Classic you think is worth a mention? Drop it down below. And as always, thank you all so much for watching and listening in, and I'll see you all in the next one very soon.